Thank you for joining us. The feature that you're watching today is brought to you by Rochester Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm James Hill and I have the pleasure of sitting here with our very own Laura Long. For those who don't know her personally, she works in the primary division, or the lower division of our Sabbath School department, and she also works making our church beautiful. She has a degree in elementary education from Emmanuel Missionary College, better known today as Andrews University. So thank you for being here today, Laura.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. We're glad to be here.
All right, thank you so much.
I'd like to add that I actually graduated from Andrews University.
Excellent.
Because I was in the very first class that they gave degrees to.
Awesome. Now, I have been wanting to sit down with you for an interview for about a year now. And I've had this anticipation because we met out in the foyer, first time officially last year, and you shared something very important with me and special with me. Can you tell our audience about that?
I believe that was when I had told you that my grandfather, J.I. Beardsley, was the president of Oakwood College back in the early 20s.
Yes. And I thought that was very fascinating. You also shared with me something very special. And this is a book called Make Bright the Memories. And this is a book about Eugenia Cunningham. And it was very special to me for a couple reasons. When I was young, I went to Oakwood College campus quite frequently, and so I was familiar with Cunningham Hall. And so getting to know more about her story was very special. And I was also able to find my own copy online.
Oh, good.
So it's a nice part of my library now. Now, your grandfather was one of the first presidents of Oakwood College. And for those who don't know, Oakwood College is one of Seventh-day Adventism's premier HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities. And it started off as Oakwood Industrial School, later on Oakwood Manual Training School. But by the time your grandfather came on board, Oakwood was making another transition.
Actually, he was hired, we've found out in some of our research just late this week or so, that he was called there on purpose because he had the degree from a college that he could, and the experience also, to upgrade Oakwood to a junior college. That was his aim. That was what he was brought there for.
Right. And because of that, he's got the special distinction of actually being their first president.
Right, because they didn't call them presidents. They were principals before him.
That's right, yeah. And
But he went there in 1917 and left in 1923.
got ya.
About 6 years.
About 6 years. So he came on to be their first principal, trying to transition them to a junior college model. And he had a degree, which was essential for the job. And where did he go to get his degree from?
He got his degree from Union College.
Gotcha.
In 1909.
All right. Nebraska, Lincoln. And where did he go after that?
After that, he was actually educational secretary for the South Dakota Conference for about a year. And my grandmother, who had graduated from Union College in 1908 and knew him from there, was teaching in one of the schools there. And they got married after he graduated, and in 1909 still were called to go up to Lacombe, Alberta, Canada, and start the industrial school there, which is now Canadian University College, I think, technically.
Yes, the Canadian CUC. All right, excellent. And so your grandfather left or the Canadian, what is now Canadian Union College, for an assignment all the way down in Alabama.
In between, he did spend a couple years in Iowa tending to some family business
Gotcha.
that
Okay.
came up. His father-in-law had passed away, who owned a huge farm, and he
Gotcha.
had to help that family do the transitions.
Sure, sure. So he took a small break to handle some family business, and then after that, he was called down to Alabama.
Right.
Excellent. So that's very, very interesting. Who did he bring with him to Alabama at that time?
Well, my father and his older sister, Alberta, were both born up in Canada, and so they were there. Another sister joined in Iowa, I believe.
Okay.
And they came with 3 children. And my grandmother, of course, and his mother came with them and taught the children in a little home church school.
Gotcha, gotcha. So they went down with a caravan.
He left with a bigger caravan.
Right, I'm sure. Yeah, yeah.
Actually, that's an interesting story too, because when he left there, he was going to Nebraska to Shelton Academy, or it's now Platte Valley Academy, and he boxed everything up in a train boxcar.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And took my father, who was 13, with him. And the 2 of them went on the boxcar with all their family belongings across country.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was, at that point in time, that was a big trip. That was quite a big trip. Now, going down south is a pretty tall task, right?
I think it was for them, yes.
Yeah. 1896, Oakwood started. So about 20 years later, he's called to help transition the school to the junior college model. What was his time like there at Oakwood?
I have just been finding out because actually we did not hear much about it when I was growing up.
Sure.
I think it was a tough time for the family. It was also a tough time for the school.
Sure, yeah.
And maybe you want to address that more.
Yeah, we certainly will. So as an HBCU, it's historically black college and university. But as most HBCUs of that day, they started off with white administration. And so Oakwood had for 20 years had all white administrators. And your grandfather was one of the last, the second.
He was next to the last,
Next to the
right.
last. First president, and then the second president became their last, at least white president of of the college at that time, junior college. So there was at the school some ambition and rumblings to
Unrest.
get a little bit of unrest to get some more representation of the school. And so he came in at a time where the student body was looking for change.
But I think the greater change from what we've discovered in things you and I have been reading this last
Right.
week or two was that they really wanted a more academic program.
Yes.
And the school had been set up to be an industrial school to teach young people how to fill in those service-type opportunities in the world. And they wanted, I think, to get into the area where they could be professionals or pre-professionals.
Yes, yes. And so I'm glad you bring that up because the model for almost every African-American kind of focused school at that time was industrial.
Booker T. Washington
Yes.
and George Carver.
Yes,
You know.
yes. And so that Booker T. Washington model was how things were done. And So it was very industrial.
Well, then add to that Mrs. White's counsel on schools right at that time was very strong on the work-study program.
100%, yes. And so, not right, exactly. So not only was that the model for the South, but Sister White's writings reinforced that industrial model. And we saw that not only at Oakwood, we saw that industrial model at Madison. Your grandfather was at Alberta Industrial School prior to coming to Oakwood Industrial School. So that was a very Adventist thing to do.
Exactly.
To have a lot of industries.
And I think he pushed the limit.
So, yeah.
In addition to adding the academic.
Right, yes. So at this point, I think it's a good time to mention that in this book about Eugenia Cunningham, she went to the Oakwood School initially as a student before coming on as faculty. In one of the middle chapters of the book, she talks about when she went to Oakwood. And one of the students came to pick her up horse and buggy. And on the way to the campus, she said, well, what do you guys do? And he said, same thing as everybody else does, work. And she said, well, where do you work? And he said, on the farm, and this industry, on that industry. And she said, well, okay, well, when do you start? And his reply was, we eat breakfast at 5:30. And they had night classes. I think it was from 7:30 to 8, 7, I think, to 8:30. And so it was definitely weighted towards the work side of things. And that had gone on for a long time. And the academic side of things was, a little bit less emphasized.
But from what you have found out in some of your research, what Grandpa did, yes, he worked towards a junior college situation, but what he did was added on to a very heavy work program, and that used that. I have a feeling that the people felt used, and I think he did use them to upgrade the plant.
Oh,
certainly. The grounds, the added acreage.
Yes.
And built up the industries at a tremendous rate.
Yes. Now, he did a few things while he was there. He was able to, one, almost triple the size of the campus. I think they started off with 380 acres, added another 618 acres his first year there. And it rapidly expanded their capacity for storage, improved their water supply on the campus. And I believe I also read that they started day school, some day classes, which was, an upgrade from
for academics.
Yes, exactly. And so,
but it amounted to a matter of great growth.
Yes.
In a very short time.
Yes.
And that can be disconcerting.
It can be. And to add to that, the population of the school is growing. And whenever that grows, you get, more and more students and more, diversity of perspectives. I think when Oakwood started out, it had to have a strong emphasis on industry because, for one, keeping the school afloat, it needed that. And two, just as a point of history, the South didn't want people coming down teaching African Americans how to read and write and to, better themselves in that way.
Well, historically.
Historically, yeah.
Yeah, at this point, they were ready, I think, to accept that more.
They were.
Because there was nothing else to do.
That's right. Yeah, and to kind of to speak to that point, when it started, Booker T. Washington model was called the Atlanta Compromise because of the industry piece. But before your granddad got there, the state had come by and said, you guys need to do a little bit more academics. And so, yes, when he got there, the climate was a little bit more favorable to being more academic, at an African American school. So, a little bit of tension. People wanted change. He gets there. Slightly tumultuous time, I think you shared with me.
My father wrote a biographical sketch of his father, of Grandpa, and in it he said, and I don't think I can find it now.
That's all right. While you're looking for that, what I want to do is just kind of show one of the images from, this is an image of your grandfather, I believe, from the time that he was at Oakwood
there,
College.
right.
And we'll put this up on the screen, but very handsome fellow, nice starched collar. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him and the caravan of his family
No.
At that time.
In this biographical sketch my father wrote, he said that about his father, he mentions that Grandma was so concerned for his life because of riots taking place, that she had, quotes, stuck right by his side and day and night, determined that she share any fate that might befall him. In other words, she wasn't going to let him die and her not die with him.
That's right. I'm going with you.
But my father felt that it was to his dad's credit that the explosive situation was controlled, and that the energies of his staff were turned to the constructive program of developing a junior college program.
Got you, yeah.
And he, you asked me about whether he told any stories about those days, and
right.
I really don't have anything like that. But it makes me think of a time when I was probably about 5 years old.
Yes.
And he took Mother and me, and I don't know if the babies went with us, but to a black church that was close by to attend a service there. Now, it may be that he was trying to explore possibility of interaction between their young people and his young people in the school he was working with.
Right.
And I don't know.
Gotcha.
But I was just totally fascinated. The music was so different.
Right, sure.
And it really was something great and wonderful, too.
Gotcha.
And so I had an interest in it. And I'm sure he picked up an interest in these things, too, when he was a boy at Oakwood.
Got you. Yeah, certainly. So it's quite unfortunate that they had kind of some tension while they were there at Oakwood. Do you think that was contributed to them leaving at the 6-year mark?
I'm sure it had its impact.
A little bit of impact.
I suspect that it also was important for them at that point. When my father was 12, 13, his sister 11, 12, just entering their teens, for them not to be taught by the same teacher in a homeschool type situation, and get into a regular school where they had friends that they could get to know, other kids to play with.
Right, sure. And
because I don't think there was much mixing on the campus of Oakwood.
Yeah, yes. That was one of the issues with the president to follow. That was one of the issues that the student body was concerned about, being able to mix, freely. But when he left, he did quite a bit on the campus. And one of the statements that I found written about your grandfather, that he was a man who had a grace with words. That was on the Oakwood website. So I think, he was generally respected. And he left there with a parting gift from the staff. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. When we were children, we would beg Daddy to get out Black Smiles and read to us. I can actually show you the book, but
Sure, sure. We'll put an image of the book
whoops,
on our screen
you're
there.
going to do that. Okay.
Now,
It was a book of poetry written by a black, actually, you found out for me
Yeah.
that it was a black student who wrote and published the book, and it was published by the Southern Missionary Society,
Yes.
which was at Madison, I suspect.
yep, up in Nashville,
And
right?
was it in Nashville?
Yeah, in Nashville.
Okay,
Um,
and it was an Adventist institution at that
Yes.
time,
Yes.
publishing company.
That's right. That's right. And so that book is very special because he was the first African American Adventist to publish a book. So quite a special book.
And it's almost torn up because we had Daddy read to us out of it so often.
Oh, sure, sure, sure. Fortunately, it is online, so people can read it.
Well, and it's all written in vernacular, and he was able to put all the nuances into it that made it sounded like pre-Civil War
Yep.
black time.
Certainly, certainly, yep, certainly. All the diction that they used at that time, and if you're not from the South, it's quite difficult to read.
Yeah.
So I can pick up a little bit of it being from Georgia.
Yeah.
You still have a copy of that book, still in tatters, but very special book, kind of nonetheless. Now, you didn't get to hear a lot of the stories from your grandfather directly.
No. Grandpa was killed in an automobile train accident when he was 62 on, it was April 1942. He was on the staff at Adelphian Academy, one of the academies that no longer exists.
Right.
And it was a really of a shocking thing. We have one picture of our family together, and I think you would show that to them.
Yes, we're going to put that image up. If you could kind of walk through who that is in the photo.
Well, my dad and my grandpa.
Okay, Dad, top right.
And my dad passed away when he was 60
Wow.
from a
same-
heart
similar
attack.
age.
And so both men were gone young, and we didn't have that opportunity to want to talk about the olden days.
Sure,
You know,
sure.
you get more to doing that when you get older.
That's right. That's right. When you're young, you really can't appreciate it.
Daddy was holding my baby sister, who lives in California now. This was my grandmother, and she passed away about 17 years after Grandpa, I think. Then this was their daughter, Alberta. She was married to Raymond Jacobs.
Sure, sure.
Ray Jacobs, and these down here are her two boys, Roger and Dennis, and they were missionaries in Peru at the time. She was home on a furlough and staying with her parents in Holly, Michigan, and they all came down to Kentucky to visit with us, and that's when this picture was taken, just a couple weeks before he was killed.
Gotcha.
And then down here is my mother, my brother, me in the middle, and my Aunt Dottie, who had just finished her nurse's training at Washington Adventist Hospital and was going to marry a doctor there in just a couple months.
Gotcha. Excellent doctor-nurse combo. That is a very, I'm sure, valuable picture for you and your family.
Yes, it's one of the special ones.
Yes, and I'm sure that was a pretty difficult time, when your grandfather passed away. Now, your dad followed in his footsteps in being highly involved in Adventist education
Right.
in Pewee
Valley,
Valley, Kentucky.
It's actually an eastern suburb of Louisville now.
Got ya. Yeah. And so you have a family history of being highly involved in upstarting Adventist schools. And you went into education yourself. Do you think that had some role to play in you choosing to be a
I'm
teacher?
sure. You asked me why I became a teacher once, and I said, huh?
Yes, yes.
because everybody expected me to be a teacher, and I think it's probably because I was so bossy.
That's all right. That's all right. And it's
But-
kind of an Adventist thing to be a teacher or a nurse.
Well, and that's the thing. In the late 50s and early 60s, there was no guidance given to women. You had to really want to do something specific to get into anything but being a teacher or a nurse or a secretary.
Yeah, yeah. It's that's how society does us sometimes, puts us in tracks, and you got to do a little bit extra to get outside of that track.
So I got my teaching and my secretarial.
Got it. You got both.
I wasn't interested in nursing.
That's all right. Now, so you went to Andrews University to get your teaching degree, and then where'd you go from there?
Well, I decided I didn't want anything more to do with cold weather and snow. And here I am in Minnesota.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
But at that point, I wrote to the conference office in Florida and said, "Do you have an opening for a first-year teacher?"
Yeah, yeah.
And they did.
Got
They
you.
assigned me to the church school in Gainesville, Florida. It was a one-room school in a little room added on to the back of the church.
Yeah.
And it was 13 students in 8 grades plus a 9th grader who was doing home study under my supervision.
Gotcha. Sounds like the Little House on the Prairie, Little Red Schoolhouse. Yeah, yeah. So lots of good experience for a first year.
Yeah,
Teaching.
it was rough, and I told the conference superintendent at the end of that year that he really needed to get somebody that had more experience in there to get the kids up to par, because I knew I hadn't gotten through everything.
Gotcha. Sure, sure.
And they put me in teaching 5th and 6th grade in Tampa.
Next year.
And during that time, I'd gotten to know Charles.
Yeah.
We'd become engaged and were planning to get married, and so there was not an opening for a church school teacher in Jacksonville, so I didn't have a job planned. And then he broke up with me.
That rascal. Okay.
And I was taken on to the staff in Orlando at the conference office.
Got ya.
I worked there for about half a year before I accepted a call to go as the secretary in the Far Eastern Division
Got ya. Singapore?
in Singapore.
Now, that was quite
So
an
I was
experience.
over there for 2 years, and Charles and I started writing again before I came back, and when I got back, we got married 3 weeks later.
Got ya. Wonderful. Wonderful to cap that love story back together. So you go away to Singapore. You come back to Jacksonville. You and Charles tie the knot. And
I don't have a job
yes.
in the church school, so I got a job in an office downtown,
All right.
and Charles was just on my case to get back to teaching. He thought I was wasting my talents, I guess.
Well, yeah.
And I didn't know anything about public schools. I had never been in one a day in my life. I didn't know how they operated, how to work with them. I finally got up my courage and called the principal at a school that was close by. And she said, well, she didn't need a teacher, but she talked to me a while and got my background.
Yeah.
And she says, but I'll keep your number and call you if anything comes up.
Got ya.
And I did get a call back from her. She had a special situation where she had a budget for a resource teacher. And she thought, with my background, I might be able to help her with that. And so I was thrown into the public school system, which was okay. I at least had my foot in the door now.
Right.
And I was sent to a small school in the older part of downtown Jacksonville, but it was all white.
Yep.
But that was in about 1968, 69, and the state, as you had pointed out to me,
Yeah.
was fighting against the Supreme Court orders to integrate.
Yeah, yeah.
They had a plan, though, and it became obvious that pretty soon that order was going to come, and it came during Christmas vacation.
Yeah.
And we, teachers were invited back after vacation to a whole new situation.
Sure, a whole new dynamic.
Every school had to have their faculties, their staff, integrated to 70% white and 30% black, which was the percentages distribution
population.
for the county.
Mhm.
That meant that they switched teachers between white schools and black schools.
Mhm.
I had 1 week. They gave the children an extra week of vacation, and we had 1 week to finish up all our evaluations, grades, everything, pack up all our stuff to get out of our room.
Right.
Actually, 2 days for that. One day, the other teacher came over and sat with me, and I integrated her into my classroom.
Right.
The next day, I went to her old classroom,
Right.
and she integrated me into her classroom.
Yes, yes.
And then we had Friday to prepare classes for Monday.
Right. That is a whirlwind of change.
Yeah, whirlwind of change, yes.
Now, and just for context, none of the schools in Jacksonville have been integrated.
Nothing was integrated.
Adventist or
No.
public.
No, none
Otherwise.
of the Adventist schools were.
Gotcha. And
None
you-
of the churches were.
Yeah.
Nothing was at that point.
And so, being a brand new public school teacher, and on top of that, being thrown into this, very new situation of integrating in the midst of a civil rights movement, was an experience.
Yes.
Say nonetheless.
It was difficult because of the stress on everyone. And a lot of the teachers couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I know there were classrooms in my new school that were taught by substitutes for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
And I found out when I started trying to figure out where my students were that I had been wrong in my assessment of whether integration was needed or not.
Sure. Now, you shared with me, there was a popular opinion and during that time, and that was that, why do we need to change?
Right.
Is it necessary?
And I subscribed to that
Mm-hmm.
because it seemed like the blacks had the newer schools.
Sure.
They were better than ours. They were, they had better equipment. And they wanted to be, have their own people.
Sure. Yeah.
So why did we need to do all this integration?
Now, granted, speaking, there are a lot of places where that wasn't the case. The whole, when Oakwood started, just kind of to go back to that, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal was established, 1896, and kind of follow that up with Brown versus Board of Education. When you were starting to be a teacher, said that, separate wasn't equal. And so there were a lot of places where they didn't have the newer school.
Well, I found out
Yeah.
because I can give an example.
Sure.
This is 3rd grade that I'm teaching. I had about 30 kids,
Yeah.
28, 30, something like that. Of those, I would say about 6 or 7 were doing anywhere near 3rd grade level work.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Probably another 8 or so were able to do 2nd grade level work. Another 8 were maybe able to read a primer
Sure.
In other words, early first grade.
Right.
But they were able to do something, and they could be counted on to follow through on something.
Sure.
And then there was that last 5 or 6 or so that you just hoped would be absent.
Sure. Sure.
They were problems. They probably, some of them didn't belong in a classroom.
Sure.
And they were absent so much that you couldn't begin to feel like they were getting anything.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I, from my point of view, felt like it was more important to spend my time on the ones that I could help.
Got ya. Yeah. Yeah.
And the upper levels, and try to help them come to a point where they could be more equalized.
Sure. Sure.
And I say that because I'm pretty sure from my experience that the black teachers that had been teaching them were not up to par.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
And I say that because for instance, one of the first things I did in language arts, I was trying to get across the point of view of a sentence, that it needed to begin with a capital letter.
Right.
It needed to end with a punctuation mark. And we talked about periods and exclamation marks and
Yes.
question marks.
Yep.
Okay. So then I wrote 3 little tiny short sentences, maybe 3 to 5 words in each sentence, all in lowercase. And I said, now you copy those down, but I want you to put a capital letter at the beginning.
That's right.
And figure out what kind of punctuation needs to go at the end and put that at the end. Now, that should be easy to do for a first grader, really. They all came back with their papers copying exactly what I put up there, and that was it.
Sure. Sure.
It went right over their heads. They had no idea what I was. And looking back now, I wonder if maybe it was me. They didn't understand what I was saying
Sure.
because I didn't know how to relate to them
Got ya.
somehow. And it's occurred to me what a real problem this was for the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Integration was going to be a useful
I
thing.
mean, they
for
probably
them.
didn't
Yeah.
understand my speech.
Possibly. You were from the north, they were from the south. That could have been part of it. Who knows? But it sounds like to me, you recognize that integration was important.
It was. It was needed.
Yeah. And you continued on, and we're going to put up a picture of your class.
One of my classes,
your
and
classes.
a couple years later than that.
Yeah. I think it was 71, 72, and the breakdown of that class, you mentioned earlier it was going to be a 70-30 mix,
Right,
white to black, and that was going to mirror the population.
right.
But as you can see,
because the second year I was there, they did integrate the classes all to 70-30 also.
Right. Got ya, yeah. But this picture doesn't look like that.
No.
Yeah.
The picture is about 70% black and 30% white,
Yeah.
because so many of the white parents wouldn't send their kids to public school then.
Gotcha. Yeah, and
That was another part of the integration problem.
Yeah.
All these little home schools, private schools
Yes.
started up all over the place. By a couple years later, it had sort of evened out
Sure.
because they found out it wasn't so easy to operate a school.
Yes, exactly. We're going to put up another picture of you and your teacher colleagues.
Oh, yes.
And this is just a year before the picture with your classmates. And these are all the colleagues that you worked with at a third grade school. You kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yes, I didn't tell that. Well, then, when we had to integrate the classrooms and the students, it was done by grouping schools that were in a similar neighborhood. And they drew their neighborhoods to include, in this case, where I was, 3 schools.
Yeah.
And the one I was in was an older school that had a second floor and fewer classrooms, only about 10, 11, 12 classrooms. Then there was a bigger, newer school on one level that they put the first and second graders. My school, they felt could handle the stairs, and they
Sure.
had third graders. We had the whole school was just third grade.
Right, that is,
And then the
Interesting.
fourth, fifth, and sixth graders were all out at this large, newer school in the black community.
got you. So quite creative way of getting.
But that was the
putting
way
schools
they
together.
handled it for the first few years there.
Right.
I have a story
Yeah.
that happened a bit, in this other situation where I was using a professionally made thing that
Sound
program
of the
for
letter.
sounds of letters,
Mhm.
and I was showing the child a W, and the picture that was on the card was of a worm,
Right.
and I asked him, "Now what is this? What's the picture of?" "Beep." And I said, "What?" "Beep." What was that?" "Beep." And I said, "Can you say it slower?" "Beep." And it took me days
Yeah.
trying to figure out, and it finally came to me that he was telling me it was bait.
That's right. Yeah.
It was
yeah.
the worm is the thing that goes on the hook where you're fishing. It was bait.
Right.
And it wasn't a worm, it was bait.
Yeah, and he was
So I
following
didn't start with
instructions.
W.
Exactly. Right.
Anyway, I had to make my own sound charts.
Excellent.
But we were wanting me to tell about the teachers.
Yes. So that's how there was a little bit of rockiness with understanding the students, what they were understanding you to do, and how did the teachers do with having colleagues from across the railroad tracks, so to speak?
In my school, things went pretty smoothly, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I had no problems. In fact, my best friend among the teachers was a black teacher.
Yeah.
She helped me figure out that when we had to do a health assessment on the kids every day, whether they had done all their healthful living things.
Yeah.
And I asked her, I said, "Mrs. Jones, how do I know if one of these little boys has combed his hair?"
Yeah.
I had no idea. And she says, "Well, if it's got lint in it, he hasn't been combed."
Excellent advice.
Aha.
Excellent advice. That's the 101.
But anyway, she helped me a lot with a lot of things. We had decided to have a Christmas party for our staff. We worked out a menu, and each person was going to bring a certain dish. And we had, I had volunteered that they
Yeah.
could have it at my apartment. And everybody agreed. So the night came, and all the white teachers showed up on time, but none of the black ones. And I couldn't believe that they wouldn't come. And I was hurt
Yeah.
because not only did they have a big part of the meal,
Right?
but I felt it was kind of letting me down and an affront to me personally, And I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Well, we kind of just talked and went on and waited and hoped that they would show up, and then they started coming. And I asked my friend Mrs. Jones, I says, "How come you're all so late?" And she says, "Child, if we'd all come while it was light and people could see us, you'd be having a cross burning in your front of your house." And I said, "What?" I couldn't believe it, that still that kind of thing would be going on and that they would be afraid of that. And they were protecting me.
Yeah.
And I appreciated it, but it just blew my mind.
Got you. Yeah, that's an amazing story, and a sad story. About that time period, but that's how things were. I'm going to show this picture of you and your colleagues. Mrs. Jones, was that her name?
Yeah. here I am, and here she is, both of us with the big hair of the 70s.
Okay, right next to you. Okay. Well, it sounds like you made a lot of good friends there among the teachers.
You know, I corresponded with the school secretary for years. Ran across one of her Christmas letters just the other day when I was sorting things.
Awesome, awesome. Tumultuous time for your grandfather, kind of tumultuous time for you. You didn't stay in education very long after that, is that right?
No, I didn't.
Got
No.
you.
I
Take
needed, when I taught school, Charles said I taught 24/7,
Yes.
and I dreamed it. I talked it in my sleep. And once I had a child, I couldn't do that.
Sure, sure.
And so I've concentrated my teaching in the Sabbath school now.
Got you.
And I feel like it's very, very important at the age I'm teaching to get the idea across that church is special. It's a fun place to come.
Excellent.
We can learn interesting things. And I think it'll stick with them, a lot of them.
Good, good.
I have
good.
kids that are college kids come in and stop by my Sabbath school room now.
Yeah, excellent,
I have
excellent.
some second generationers too.
You know, I think teachers from your elementary school years, some of the most meaningful kind of teachers in your life. At least I know that to be the case for me. Having gone through that experience with integration, you did kind of hint toward, you know, the fact that it wasn't just the public schools, but also the church and everything was not as well integrated. I wanted to ask you something that I've heard several times throughout my life, and I'm not that old, but I've heard several people recount a story where people of different backgrounds, races or ethnicities interact, and I've heard this several times. One person says to the other person, "When we get to heaven, I'm going to go to your side of heaven and hang out with you guys." Have you heard anything like that before?
No, but what's just saying makes me laugh.
It's a silly statement, right?
Because I have said for years and years, sitting on church board in other places, that, and I've come away from those meetings saying, what do they think it'll be like in heaven? Is God
Yes.
ought to have all of this group in one planet, and all of this group on another planet, and all of this group on another planet?
Right.
And I tend to feel that if we can't get along here on earth, we're not going to get to heaven to find out.
I agree. That's a very important point. We will not get there to find out. Why do you think it's so hard for us to get past that? You know, why have we been so slow, do you think, to interact freely, you know, with each other as one family?
Fear.
Okay.
Feelings of inadequacy. We sense the difference and we don't want to offend. We aren't quite sure how to act in the other people's space,
Right.
what's acceptable and what isn't.
Sure.
We don't know what to expect or how we might react. And it's on both sides.
Sure. Yes, 100%. Yeah.
In fact, it's true about more than just race. It's true about economic status. It's true about where we come from,
Yeah.
our background. All of us have an innate need to associate with people who understand us and who understand our experiences.
Right. And it's uncomfortable to be outside of that.
And we
milieu.
don't know that the others will.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we don't know if we can understand them.
Right.
And the only possible way to make this work is to get to know each other well enough.
That's right. Personally.
And I have a little thoughts on this too.
Go ahead. Share.
Back when our church was when we first came here, and for many years after, we didn't have any blacks to speak of. There might be one
Sure.
pass through occasionally, but not to be a part of us.
Sure. Mhm.
And when we started having more and more black people come in and join our congregation, we felt like we needed this to get acquainted.
Yes.
And so we really, actually, I remember on church board, we saying we've got to have more social events
Mhm. Mhm.
so that we can get to know each other.
Yes.
So we tried to do that, and the blacks never came.
Got you. Mm.
And so we didn't have an opportunity ever to get to know each other.
Yes. Yes. And I'm glad that you said it's on both sides, because the ownership has to be across the board.
It needs to be.
We have to get to know each other so we don't have that discomfort, so that we understand where we're more alike than different.
Yes, we are more alike than different.
And, I was thinking about this today. The goal of the gospel is to unite heaven and earth. And the same goal of the gospel is to unite all of these families on earth together. But that's also the means of the gospel. If we cannot interact and intermingle here, then we're not going to interact and intermingle there. And so I think it's one of those things where the process is the end goal to a degree. So thank you for sharing your experience of your grandfather, who's such an important figure, and your own experience with integration in those late 60s, early 70s in Florida. If it doesn't benefit anyone, I feel like it has richly benefited me to sit here and chat with you about these things. And so thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.